Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining the 14th edition of FREAKTION BAR, a series of informal discussions organized by the Kersnikova Institute, where we meet with extraordinary individuals whose research has led them to the intersection of art, science, and technology. Usually, the events take place live in a club-like setting. However, in these COVID-19 times, we had adapted to the conditions and moved the discussions online. Tonight's edition is entitled Intoxicated by Estrogen and is organized within the framework of Biofriction, a European Commission co-founded Creative Europe project, which supports bioart and biohacker practices and operates as a catalyst for the changes in the relations between science, technology, and society. The discussion will focus on the early stages of Adriana Knouf's project Synological Entanglements 1, aromatase, which aims to engineer testicular cells that would produce estrogen rather than testosterone, thereby highlighting the potential for the mutability of sex from within. The event is being recorded and will be later available for online viewing. I would also like to greet and thank our guest speakers, Aymard, Neža Grgurevič, Brezavšček, and of course Adriana Knouf. To introduce them quickly, Aymard is a trans activist. She currently works at the Transakcija Institute, a trans-feminist initiative and the first and only non-governmental organization devoted specifically to human rights of transgender persons in Slovenia, where she edits the TransTube channel, offers peer support to transgender persons, and leads a support group. She is also active in the field of video and documentary film as an independent camera operator, director of photography and Steadicam operator, and has co-created the production space 303. Neža Grgurevič holds a PhD in veterinary medicine and is an assistant professor at the veterinary faculty and the Faculty of Health Sciences Novo Mesto. Her research is largely focused on the brain and the endocrine system. Some of the main questions that her research addresses are: what factors can cause permanent changes to the brain? How do these factors influence the difference between the male and the female brain? And how does this affect the behavior of adults? She has also been active in the fields of education and psychotherapy. After giving lectures at the Sigmund Freud University in Ljubljana for several years, she is currently a lecturer on physiology at the Faculty of Health Sciences Novo Mesto and the Biotechnical Faculty in Ljubljana. Brezavšček is a PhD student of philosophy exploring the subjects at the intersection of philosophy, feminism, and broader choreographical practices. She has been active in the field of criticism for over a decade as a contributor to Radio Student and Dnevnik, and has also published in various journals and expert publications home and abroad. In 2019, she became the co-editor of the contemporary performing arts journal Maska and the online platform for criticism neodvisni.art. And last but not least, Adriana Knouf, PhD, works as a synologist, as an artist, scientist, writer, designer, engineer. She engages with topics such as biological art, space art, radio transmission, non-human encounters, drone flight, queer and trans futurities, the voice, and papermaking. She's the founding facilitator of the Transino Lab, a nomadic artistic research laboratory that promotes entanglements amongst entities trans and xeno. Adriana is also an assistant professor of art and design at Northeastern University and is the author of How Noise Matters to Finance and other written work on topics like bioart, queer and trans existences, and weird temporalities. My name is Domen Ograjenšek, and I will be moderating tonight's discussion. For more information about our speakers, you can visit the event page on kersnikova.org, where you can find extended CVs. You can also submit any questions that you might have in the stream's comment section. The questions will be answered towards this second part of the event. So perhaps it would be interesting to start the discussion with one of the concepts that seem to be central for Adriana's research and work, that is Synology. The ideas it presents, bundles, could be associated with many of the topics that we will discuss tonight, and could thus offer an interesting frame or backdrop to our discussions. Adriana, in one of your writings, you mentioned that the term originates in both science fiction and science fact. What is Synology? How did it find its place in your research and work? And how do fiction and fact meet or are entangled in your work?
Great. Thanks, Domen, for that introduction. Thanks, Pia, Leah, Neža, Kersnikova, for everyone who's making this event possible. So Synology, this is a term that I've been developing and working with over the past few years. And it's really a concept that comes out of some research and ideas actually within the search for extraterrestrial intelligence or studies of aliens. Actually. So the term was originally developed for people who are trying to think about the extraterrestrial life within the realm of science fiction. And so, you know, how do the different types of alien civilizations exist? How do they form? How do they communicate? What's their technology and so forth within the realm of the science fiction, right? Later on, this term was expanded by Robert Freitas to look at the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, actually, which is, you know, as some of you may know, an existing project of trying to discover signals from different types of extraterrestrial, quote unquote, civilizations. And so the idea here was to think about within the realm of science fact, let's say, or how would you think about extraterrestrial life? And so I came across this term as I began to think shortly after my transition, you know, how can I relate my work to some of these feelings of being strange or alien or other that I was having and that I had had for a very long time in my life. So I have this story that I tell now that many of you may have also experienced at some point in your life. So when I was quite young, I ended up growing up in this very small town in Iowa in the middle of the United States. And it was a farming village, 600 people, very, very dark, very, very rural, definitely not a place for queer or trans people, especially when I was growing up in the 80s or 90s. And so for lots of reasons, but some of which may have been due to some budding notion of transness, I felt quite alien. And I didn't really feel comfortable on this planet Earth. And so I would go into my backyard with a flashlight, point it up at the stars and turn it on and off in some sort of signal to extraterrestrial entities to come and take me away from this planet, because I felt like that the planet wasn't very hospitable. So let's try going out into space with some sort of extraterrestrial entity. So something about this travel to space, which is a very inhospitable place, felt more hospitable to me. And so there was this notion of a relationship to the alien, to the xeno, to the strange that has always been there for a long time. And so, you know, when I began transitioning and started taking hormones and sort of experiencing the ways that hormone replacement therapy was changing my body and changing my relationship to the world, I was thinking about Synology as a way to explode open the possibilities of our transformations, right? If this is possible, what else might be possible? And not only what else, but maybe it's a good idea to think of ourselves as trying to push ourselves into a more stranger alien state as a way to examine and explore all of these possibilities that are out there that are oftentimes limited within a capitalist system, is the way I see it, right? So for me, this getting back to some of the particularities of the question, right? This notion of science fiction, science fact, the fiction in general, this is a way in which I see different types of possibilities being able to be explored. And then for me, as sort of an artist, scientist, xenologist, it's often about taking from those ideas and then trying to materialize them, seeing what happens when the material sort of has its own machinations and does its own thing, and sort of how do you relate to that? How do you change to that? How do you react to that? And then sort of pushing it from there.
The event is entitled Intoxicated by Estrogen, which hints at the molecule's ability to permeate our entire being, as well as its ability to cause a shift in our state of mind, a joyous shift. Would you care to comment or expand upon this notion of molecular joy or molecular joyfulness that can be associated with intoxication?
Yeah, sure. So, some people who have been on hormone replacement therapy, either as transgender, non-binary people, or maybe perimenopausal people who have gone on hormones, may have some idea of what I'm talking about, some lived experience of this. So, prior to transitioning, I wouldn't say I was really a social constructivist, but I really sort of felt that a large part of sort of identity, performative identities and so forth was related to different types of social cultural ideas. And I still believe that is very much true to a certain extent. It was really the effect of this molecule estradiol on my body that really kind of exploded open the possibilities for me, and really exploded open my relationship to the world and to my body as well. So, I have used the term molecular jouissance before, sort of as a way to kind of get at that idea of exploding open, of sort of this limit of this, of sort of pushing to the boundaries of things, and also the painfulness of that as well, because transitioning on hormones is not always purely joyous either. I did a performance, I guess about a month and a half ago now at Kersnikova called Trying Plastic Variations that was partially about this. And in that performance, I was sort of exploring not only the joyful aspects of this, but the painful aspects of it as well. So to give a context of this for those of you who weren't able to see the performance, basically in the second half of the performance, I was changing my estradiol patches live in front of the audience in sort of a setup where I was facing these mirrors that then the rest of the audience could see my reflection in the mirrors, but I was facing the mirrors, not facing the audience, so they can only see my reflection. And so I removed all my clothes and then started peeling off these patches, which are very large things about, this big on my body. And then once I did that, picking off all of the residue from the patches, because in order for these patches to stick on our bodies, they need to stay on our bodies for about 3 to 4 days. They leave a lot of residue and it gets really all ugly and nasty from the clothes that you wear and so forth. And so picking it off, it also creates lots of marks, lots of damage to the body in a way as well. And so I was thinking about how I am ingesting and absorbing these hormones transdermally through these patches. And in a way, I'm quote unquote kind of contaminating my body with this exterior exogenous hormone, but I'm doing it by choice, right? Like I'm doing this because the effects on my body are desirable, they're joyful, right? They, you see all the things, you can see, okay, yes, if you're a transgender woman on hormones, yes, you're going to grow breasts, you may have decreased hair growth and things like that, smoother skin. but also the emotional effects are almost more powerful. And so for me, that's also really where the intoxication comes from, is how is it possible that this really rather simple molecule is able to have all of these complicated effects on the body? And to me, I find that incredibly fascinating. And but simultaneously, that molecule does not necessarily give us rights within a legal system. You know, especially for transgender women, it doesn't raise our voice at all. So we have to go through vocal training if we want to raise the pitch of our voice, because estradiol doesn't have any effect on that. And also, you know, how can we understand the effects of this molecule on our body while also understanding the different types of performative possibilities of the body, the discursive possibilities, and how that intersects with the molecule. So for me, that tension is really quite interesting. What at the same time that I'm experiencing this real intoxication, you know, I replace my patches twice a week, and when I get to like the day before I change my patch, I'm really feeling the lack of the molecule that's left on the patch, right? And so in a certain sense, it is a hit when I get it, when I replace it the next day.
Now, as we begin to touch upon the various molecular influences that on our bodies and the effect that they might have, it might be also a good opportunity to introduce Neža's research. Neža, in your research, you deal exactly with such influences, such as sex hormones, but also stress and genes on the development of the brain, especially pertaining to the individual sex. Could you begin by talking about these influences? What are some general ways how they impact the development of the brain? And how do these changes relate to the difference in sex?
Yes, good evening also from this side of the screen. And I have to say also for me that it is exciting to be with such a diverse group of people discussing very challenging theme, actually, sex differences. And thank you, Adriana, for sharing such an intimate story in a way. Yes, for the beginning, I would like to say some words about sex and gender, these words that were historically used very interchangeably. Even in our research, sex is often used for animals and gender for humans, but mainly I will talk about biological sex, and gender often is used for gender roles for gender identity that's connected to sexual attraction, sexual orientation. I will talk about sexual differences, how this process is going on. Maybe for clear presentation, I will share a screen with schematic presentation. Okay, I think we see the picture. So sexual differentiation is process during which sex differences arise in our bodies. It is mainly in animals and humans. And if we start from the beginning, sexual differentiation starts with right after the conception. On the picture, we can see embryo. Male embryo possess, beside chromosomes, in each cell possess 2 chromosomes, X and Y chromosome. And female embryo possess, beside chromosomes, 2 X chromosomes. And that's basically when the whole story starts. On the Y chromosome in males, there is a small gene, a signal which signals that to the development of the testes. And right at the time when testes are developed, testosterone begin to secrete and going through the through the blood to the brain of the developing fetus. And this testosterone actually already within the uterus changes the brain. So changes the structure of the brain and also the function of the brain, prepares the brain for later into the adulthood to express typical male behaviors, such as we say especially in animals. So the most interesting is that in rodents such as mice and rats, which are mainly used for this research, testosterone actually changes locally to estrogen. So therefore, estrogen is the hormone that masculinizes the brain. That is interesting because estrogen actually fundamentally is a female hormone. But during this period of time, during this fetal development, actually causes masculinization of the brain. So what about females? What is going on in female fetuses? So for now, theories, hypothesis says that female brain develop in the absence of sex hormones. Why? Because ovaries do not produce sex steroids before the birth. But recent research shows that maybe also female brain need estrogen to develop some female characteristics. But contrary to males, this happens mainly after the birth. So these changes within the brains are actually irreversible changes. So the brains in the males and the females are different in structure, are different in number of cells, in number of synapses, in different proteins, genes that express receptors, etc., etc. And that is a substrate for the later behavior. What about puberty? Puberty is another period that is very important for development. During puberty, actually sex hormones start to produce even in a larger amount than before. And that activates all the structures within the brain. And also body starts to change. We began to get this secondary sexual characteristic like hair and voice and so on, like Adriana already explained. So taking together, sexual differentiation process already begins during fetal development. And these are very important critical periods during which this process can be disturbed by different factors, environmental pollution, stress, steroids, hormonal disruptors, and so on and so on. So, Domen, yes.
Thank you, Neža. And what is the scope of the impact that outside influences like stress that you just mentioned have on this development compared to the influences stemming from within the body?
Mm-hmm. From animal research, mainly rats and rodents, it was suggested that stress during fetal development can interact with gonads and the brain, and can disturb this especially masculinization process. We observed that if the pregnant mothers were stressed during this critical period, then offspring, especially male offspring, were not expressing typical male patterns later in adulthood. In people, in humans, there is also some research that are showing that homosexual and bisexual report some stressful events during their mother's pregnancy. But there are also some research they don't report any stress. So in humans, it's very complicated. This process is very complicated, and probably it's a lot of cultural and social factors are also influencing behavior later in life. Besides that, human behavior is very hard to reduce, like observing animal behavior like sexual, which is more like reflex. We are in animals, we are studying reflexes. For example, lordosis behavior is typical female reflex, female sexual behavior to male. And it cannot be studied in such a it cannot be reduced in such way in humans.
Thank you. We already have some comments from the stream, but before that, I would like to ask the speakers, are there any questions or any comments from the other speakers on these topics that we covered so far regarding the molecular aspect of the body? And
I mean, one thing that maybe not a conversation for now, but I'm just maybe flagging it for later is this question of reduction, you know, and abstraction, and sort of the practices of science versus the practices of arts, and the different possibilities of both, which I think is something that we've talked about a little bit amongst ourselves. And I think at some point, you know, after we've had more time to hear everyone, I think that'd be a great place to have more of a conversation about.
yeah, thank you, Adriana. I think, yeah, there will be quite a few openings for this topic. I think it's really interesting later on into the discussion. Right now, I have a question for you, Adriana, from a White Feather Hunter from YouTube, tuning in from Canada. And they say, Adriana, this is super interesting listening to you describe hormonal effects on your body, which cisgender women experience in weird fits and starts throughout the course of puberty. They are interested in how a controlled quantification of estradiol patch might be a different experience of hormonal transition from patchy puberty. And they add that they write this as a cis woman who experienced a hormonal disorder called PMDD, which was corrected by taking synthetic estradiol.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thanks for that question. Amongst okay, so one of the things about taking hormones as someone who is transgender is that while there are standards of care and very carefully thought out standards of care, and you know some decent number of studies about the effects of the hormones on the body when you take these later in life, there's not enough research. And so, you know, a lot of the understanding of the effects of these hormones on the body and the different ways that we ingest these hormones comes from conversations that we have on forums online, which I think is also an interesting thing, and that is very common in different types of healthcare. It's an issue that women, non-binary people, you know, people of color often have issues with the healthcare system, not sort of researching enough these areas. So for me, since I'm on patches, I get sort of like this level of estrogen, right? It's very flat. It's, you know, except for maybe at the end of my patch period, right? But for me, it's basically a flat line, right? I don't have ups and downs. I don't necessarily have a cycle, although I'll say a little bit more about that in a bit. So it's kind of constant, right? Which is obviously very different than a cisgender woman who's on a menstrual cycle or experiences a menstrual cycle. But different types of hormones, different types of ingestions of hormones have different types of effects. So if you're on a pill, then you may have a 2 times a day or 1 times a day cycle of ups and downs. There's different ways to absorb it, either sublingually or swallowing it, or I've read people that take it rectally, you know, in order to smooth out the absorption of it by the body. And then there's injections as well. I'm really intrigued by the idea of implants, which I'm not exactly sure why there's not more of that as a possibility. But again, I think it's because there's not a lot of commercial interest in this in a way. You know, there are no hormones that I know of, at least. And if someone knows this differently, please say something in the chat, but there's no hormones that I know of that are designed specifically for transgender people. We have hormones that are developed for other purposes for cisgender people. And so the real sort of effects of this on the body when you start this at different stages of life is something that we really need to know a lot more of. But going back to the cycle question, I've intriguingly experienced and read some things recently that there are some trans women who believe that they experience a cycle, a 28-day cycle, even independent of the fact that we don't have a uterus or ovaries. And, you know, it's something that I want to explore a little bit more, you know, because I've tried to keep track of it a little bit, but I want to do it in a much more systematic fashion. Because, you know, I'm curious to see how, whether in the absence of a uterus and ovaries and sort of those sorts of things that would be developing during sort of fetal development, like Neža was just talking about, is it still possible that taking this hormone creates some sort of cycle? And I will say that early on in my transition, I went to see this woman who works as a acupuncturist, a shamaness in Mexico City, and she was basically asked, you know, saying that I needed to pay more attention to the moon in order to sort of create my own cycle for me, which, you know, opens up all sorts of questions of nature and women connected to the moon, and, you know, Pia will probably have lots to say about that in a little bit, or some aspects of that. But I think it's interesting to think about that, right? Like, what are the ways in which, even when you don't have these certain organs in your body, you know, how is it possible for some of these things to manifest themselves, and do they?
Thank you, Adriana. Yeah, that's really interesting. And before we move on to Pia Brezavšček and some of the material aspects that are in philosophy that touch on these issues, and also what you raised some minutes before this, Leia, I think, would like to add something in relation to Neža's presentation, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
Hi, Leia.
Hi. Thank you for this discussion. I just wanted to clarify a few facts about hormones and in the human behavior. Like, I think what is currently Neža describing about hormones is probably the point today where endocrinology is and where the biology is, but there's there's been a lot these few years. There've been a lot of very groundbreaking studies that shows that, I don't know, like for instance, transgender women have brain that are more similar to cis women, for instance. So a lot of things that are it's very hard here to have a clear picture about what is exactly the role of hormones. And I think even before that is already the framework in which biology is working is somehow very concentrated on analysis one aspect of what we are culturally used to package as sex and gender. And I just wanted to clarify a few points about identity in that, because it was used in the presentation, and to make a very strong differentiation with sexual orientation, because these are very completely different things. One is the question of who I am, as this is like what we call gender identity, when what we call sexual orientation is something that has actually nothing to see, which is the answering to the question to whom I'm attracted. So yeah, I just wanted to clarify this, and also because in your presentation it was reduced to the sex and to the sex of male and female sex, and I just wanted to point that I know I'm not, of course, a scientific, but I know it exists in the nature in various kind of species, but already with mammals, a variety of sex and how sex is developing, happening in different species, and species, and it's very actually it's very unknown. And I just would like to say how at the start we are about grasping these ideas, at least with hard science like biology, genetics now, that are able to help us with chromosome and that. But there's, I just wanted to make like a few points, like male and female, there's actually, as I'm aware, no real definition that is recognized as to say, like this is some things that are already identified and can be reproduced. You know, you can say in one individual that it's mainly expressing something, and we are used to see this expression between two poles. But I just want to suggest, I just want to say that in the nature, it's actually present way more sex than just male and female. And I will stop that because it's not my field of activity. No, just to also in the human being category, we have also like intersex people who are like people that are defying the norms in which we are culturally trying to think male and female, not just male and female gender identity, but male and female sex. There are just some sex which are human sexes and which are not able to be put in one or the other category. And then this sex category, the sex characteristics of these people are just expressing in another way that we are used to, and we're in the the scientific are currently quite not able to deal with that people, because they think that it's better to operate on these children when they are already newborn, and it's not a medical necessity. So it shows how actually culture has invaded, is actually at the very basis of our also scientific vision of sex.
Domen, can I react? But I think we have to move on, huh?
No. I just wanted to say, if there are any comments or other, yes. Neža, go on.
Thank you, Leah, to correct me. As gender identity, it's not necessarily connected to sexual orientation. That's true. That's why at the beginning you said about biological differences. That's why I said that this is really from biological point of view. This is mainly research on 50s, 60s on animals, and these are theories that are quite strong theories that stands. Of course, for humans, it is very, very hard to, first of all, to have a good research on that field, because brain are not easy to study, and you can do post-mortem research, but you are very limited in that way. You have some medical conditions from which we speculate what is the reason, especially medical condition, mutations, different mutations in receptors, for instance, testicular feminization, where the people don't have receptors for androgens. And that's an evidence that testosterone must be very important in humans. And most of all, science is based on statistics, and we are comparing two groups, and the difference between the females and males are not as big as the differences also within the females and within the males, and that's mainly the problem in researching humans. And maybe also when you said about the diversity of animals, just recently they also scientists start to study homosexuality in animals, because it was not allowed in a way to study that years before. So yes, also in animal kingdom, in rams and in penguins, they describe some of these similar behaviors. Yeah.
Any other comments? Leah, you have something to add, or should we move on? Or
I think we can move on.
We can also return to this topic at the end. I think this would be interesting. There's still much to unpack here, I think. But okay, for now, this material aspect of the body is also ever more present in contemporary feminist theory and philosophy. In her book, for instance, Abstract Sex, Luciana Parisi suggests that the biotechnologies of the body, such as cloning, are already part of nature. One must not look further than bacterial sex, and that when faced with such artifice of nature, the old dichotomies between nature and culture fall short. Pia, I would now like to turn to you and ask you, could you describe the role that the notions of matter and nature, once associated with essentialism and biological determinism that could be and often were weaponized against minorities and women, Could you describe the role that these notions have in what could be deemed the new material turn in feminist thought and philosophy?
Hello from my side also. Yes, thanks, Domen, for this question. I think, yes, here's really a lot to say, but maybe I would start from the beginning. So, of course, yes, women as more other, so as the other, were more associated with nature, with matter, with bodies, more than men who were the universal category. So this is, and men were, on the other hand, on the side of spirit, mind, technology. So of course, women were connected to the natural because of their menstrual cycle, because of pregnancy, because they were dealing with more fleshy things such as birthing children and so on. But of course, this is problematic, you know, because this is really based in a very dichotomic way of thinking that is based in and in Western philosophy for quite some time. In Western philosophy, for instance, in Descartes, it is this dichotomy was really strongly developed by putting on the one hand the spirit and on the other hand the matter. So what was of spirit was godly, was divine, and on the other hand, what was material, what was bodily, was made of God. So it was secondary. It was there was a strong hierarchical connection to these two, and of course the mind was on the first place. So I think that essentialism with women and with the question of women and question of the other really derives from this conception of nature. So of the conception of nature, where nature is can be dominated by men. It is on its displays, so man can take whatever it needs from this passive matter, which is there for him to use. So if, of course, then women are of nature and are there to be disposed, this is really implying this patriarchal pattern that can be seen and was seen in the Western civilization. So this was something that really impacted the how women were conceived and how the other was conceived in of course, and also in this very ontology of how Western society conceived itself. But what is interesting now, for instance, is that the nature is not anymore seen as this secondary, because in this new material turn you also you were talking about, it's really interesting that nature, the body and matter are now not something secondary to mind, to spirit, to these categories, which are more like in the domain of spirit, but in this new material term, nature, body, matter are now something that is that has agency, something that has that has its own yes, agency, that has its own means of making impact. So maybe one ontological turn that was necessary for this to happen is maybe we're considering ontologies, other ontologies, maybe Spinoza's ontology is one of those that could make possible this turn where matter comes maybe on equal terms with spirit and with the mind. So I don't think I'm going to go into details here, but maybe it's interesting to see how now matter gained some of its autonomy, and this is very important also for the new material feminisms, which are now not only engaging with this Newtonian Cartesian paradigm, but are now really tackling science, natural sciences, contemporary findings in natural sciences, such as, I don't know, quantum mechanics, chaos theory. They're tackling new findings in biology. You mentioned Luciana Parisi, and I think that her conception of the molecular is really interesting, because she speaks of these micro-feminine particle forces which are changing the body. But the body is not only this natural body no more. The body is now Deleuze-Guattarian machine, but not machine in these technical terms, but it's a machine which is now defined by a mixture of biological, technical, social, and economic desiring elements, she says. So, so this new composition, the body is not only made of natural, of molecules, but is also made of everything that determines it socially, economically, technically. So it's like this composition. So this new material turn is really interesting, I think, because it can offer us a way to think nature, body, and matter affirmatively, and it gives us a tool for, I think, for these debates that we're having now. So I think that it's not a question of biological determinism or social determinism anymore, but things are becoming more complex and I think more interesting.
Thank you, Pia. And on the other side, technology that you mentioned was associated with the spirit and again with the male, has also received a certain re-evaluation. Xenofeminism, for instance, sees technology as a crucial tool for its politics of alienation, proposing a reappropriation and repurposing of technology in order to take advantage of its emancipatory potential. So I'm also wondering if, what do you consider could be the role of technology in present and future emancipatory strives? And since this is such a broad and not at all easy question, I would also like to invite other guest speakers to share any thoughts that they might have on this subject or what you mentioned previously.
Well, I must say that, of course, I think that because of such importance of technology, such importance that it plays for contemporary society, we cannot just go around it. So we have to, yes, take it into consideration. And I think the xenofeminist way of taking it into consideration, which is, as you said, reappropriation of technology, of seizing technology, seizing the means of production and reproduction. So I think this is really a way of tackling technology. maybe what I wanted to say regarding this topic is also that, yes, you said the technology was also, of course, on the side of spirit, of mind. It was something with which we conquer the nature, so technology. But as also xenofeminists say, this is not because it is so, it doesn't mean that we have to leave it to the patriarchs, you know. We have to seize it because it is like that. Exactly because it is like that, it means it is not rational. It would be rational if it wouldn't do that. So I think that we have to really conquer for the science to be more rational in order to be feminist. So I think this is also a good point that feminists make regarding this topic. And you know, technology, it's not something new also for feminism, because I don't know, in the 70s, Shulamit Firestone was arguing for this techno utopia where we would stop birthing and we would have this exogenesis, you know, exogestation of people, and with that women could free themselves and finally become equal, because the biology is something that is pushing them down, because they have to do that in order for men to procreate. But Shulamit Firestone says something that xenofeminists repeat, I don't know, 40, 50 years later, which is, if nature is unjust, change nature. So I think this is really something to consider regarding technology. So we have to use the means of technology. Of course, the patriarchy, the capitalism is using it, technology, of course, but we have to seize it. We don't have to, we can't just leave it to it, you know, because it will be used anyway. We have to seize it, and I think not only for these big projects like this utopian exogestation or universal exogestation or something like that, but for every little, I don't know, small micro biohack, you know, that would help us to for our desires to come forth, you know, be it intoxication by estrogen or some testosterone rushes if we need them, something like that, anything like that. So I think technology should be used in feminist and other emancipatory struggles.
Thank you, Pia. That was wonderful. Any comments?
Well, yeah, I mean, thanks, Pia, exactly. I was also going to think about sort of like how we define technology, you know, insofar, are we thinking of it in sort of this contemporary sense of the metal, the tubes, the biochemistry and so forth, but I'm also thinking of it in a more ancient sense, right? And so I always return to Federici and Caliban and the Witch and sort of the technologies that we've lost, you know, that were sort of taken away from not only women, but, you know, other minorities throughout the world through colonial expansion and the rise of capitalism, right? And sort of like, for me, it's something that is really potentially quite interesting is sort of rediscovering these ancient quote unquote technologies and combining them with more modern ones. And exactly how to do that, I think, is very much an open question, and lots of, you know, some artists are working on these sorts of things these days. But, you know, we have all sorts of ways that we have been developing over the centuries and, you know, millennia of how to adjust our biochemical properties through hallucinogens or other sorts of technologies like that, right? And sort of like drawing upon some of this more ancient knowledge that has been taken away from us and trying to refigure this out and combine this with the more modern technologies, we could call it, I think would be very interesting. And yes, exactly, sort of seizing, like you're talking about, the means of reproduction and also making them available to people, right? I mean, for me, I feel very strongly about free software, open source, making sort of designs and protocols open to people so that it's not proprietary, right? This is not knowledge that can be owned, nor should it be. And you know, I think I've spent some time trying to figure out where the sources of my hormones come from in the world. And it's impossible, right? Because it's a trade secret of the pharmaceutical company that produces it, right? I don't think that's right? Like I think we need to know how these things are being produced, where are they coming from, and sort of being able to open this up, like you're talking, Pia, about like sort of on the micro daily level of this, you know, I think is really, really important and a very difficult project. But you know, I mean, in a meta sense, we're using a commercial platform today, you know, like the connections, the assemblages, all of these relationships need to be exploded in some fashion. And that's a very difficult, but a potentially powerful emancipatory project.
Thank you, Adriana. Any other comments on this subject?
I would just make a short point again about feminism and technology. I was quite interested, Pia, when you were setting it in such a way that it was like, is technology good in the context of feminism? And I was a little wondering, you know, maybe we should wonder what is feminism and what is the goal of feminism, and where I am now in this region of the world. And at that time, we, at least in this small bubble in Ljubljana, in this trans activism bubble, we strongly believe in the intersectional values, which put some aspect in feminism that the previous one were not really analyzing, which is the relation of power. And as soon as you start thinking relation of power, instead of this old debate again, very binary man woman, then you start to see individual and not, you know, and not some political, economical classes, you know, because at the end of the day, the more we divide, I think, like the more we think in that concept of male and female, and the more it exists. And it was really interesting also for me to see that we are wondering right now about the project of Adriana, because it's a trans woman trying to get access to hormones. And then we have to first wonder and open a debate to wonder if this is, and we are not going yet there, but there's some aspect of the talk that includes this ethical question. Is it right that we'll let this happen? So the possibility that actually we are making a generalization and taking the concrete example of someone who is trying to, in another context, you can understand them administrating themselves some medicine, you know, or research some something that would help in the way of living, the comfort of life, and if it would be like like something like saving life, or like obviously like doing something good for some illness. I don't know if we would have such then big battle about ethics, because then it would look very legitimate. And I'm just wondering why. I mean, it does these ethical questions of manipulation of technology. To where do we let this happen, and to what extent, and to whom, and who controls that? There's a lot of questions, but nobody is answering it anyway. That's the funny part, even in capitalism, especially in capitalism. So then, is it really the most dangerous things that can happen? That some people take the technology, take the knowledge to try to make their life better? Question.
Any replies? I mean, this question is really wonderful. Thank you, Leah, about the ethical dimension on the one side of Adriana's project, I think, but also of in the context of our debate and technology in general regarding to the trans body and experience.
I mean, I'll just say something briefly, since I want us to be able to continue with the other questions and concepts. But I mean, this is something that, is very apparent right now, especially with the recent ruling in the UK that will prevent teenage trans people from getting access to hormones, right? As part of this gender critical sort of quote unquote way of thinking about things. And, it's a very potentially very, very damaging ruling to prevent teenagers from getting access to these hormones. And so, yes, I mean, I agree, Leah. It's a very vital question to ask, right? Like, why, insofar as this is not just an intoxication, as it is also maybe a life-saving thing for some people, where does it even become a question of whether people should have access to this or not, right? I think that's something that from a I guess legal medical perspective really needs to be put under question. I'll just stop for there, since I want us to be able to get to other things.
And I'm sorry, Adriana, I will just quickly answer to that, but I was really shocked by your title, Intoxicated with Estrogen. Like, actually, again, if we place this in another context of someone taking medicine, the irony of the situation would sound obvious. But I think when people are seeing on their Facebook scroll, intoxicated by estrogen, it's already like, oh my God, like the cyberpunk movement is here. I mean, there's something that is along this question. It's not a natural question. And I think there's a lot of stereotypes and ideas that are underlying these questions.
Thank you, Leah, for this comment. And I think this can also, it's important for my next question. So it's kind of is a segue for it. And I would like to go back to Adriana and your project. As part of your residency, you are researching the means of producing estradiol, an estrogen steroid hormone, in space. And one of your previous projects, DX1, was even launched to the International Space Station earlier this year, if I'm not mistaken. Could you talk about the significance of the elements of the transgender experience enter space? And what do you consider can or will be the role of technology in future trans experience? So this, in a way, then directly relates to what we just talked about.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you for that, Domen. So TX1 was launched to the space station on March 7th this year. And yeah, it was part of 9 other artist groups who were selected through an open call through the MIT Space Exploration Initiative to send projects to the space station to orbit the Earth for a month. And we had very, very small volumes to work with, a cylinder of about 10 millimeters in diameter and 12 millimeters tall. And so our projects had to be rather simple to be able to fit into this. And, one of the things that, going back to my first sort of comments and thoughts, I want to go to space, but we don't know whether it's safe as someone who's on these hormones, right? We don't know what the pharmacodynamics of the hormones would be in a microgravity environment. And so I was not able to design an experiment or really an installation to explore these particular questions. But what I did do for TX1 was to send up fragments of my hormone replacement medication. So the estradiol patch, which I've talked about a bit already, a fragment of my spironolactone pill, which is what is taken by some transgender women in the United States to suppress testosterone. And then a fragment of this handmade paper sculpture, which I used to sort of gesture towards all of the other absent yet present xeno entities that couldn't be in this project. And so I'm going to try to do the YouTube thing here. I actually have it with me. So this is TX1. So yes, this orbited the Earth, and now it's in my hand. So it came back to Earth. At the very beginning of April, after a month on the space station, which I think is actually really important because it is, it shows that, symbolically, it was an exodus from this planet that is sometimes inhospitable to us, and its return is sort of a sign that we don't just burn up in the atmosphere, that we could actually come back and live and thrive once again. And so while this was a project that was very much about sort of my transgender experiences and desires, I hope it's also interesting and meaningful for others who experience these, conditions as a way to sort of open up and explode how we think about space and space travel. As of now, or these numbers might be a little bit off, but when I was doing a calculation earlier in the year, only 11% of people who have been to space are women, and as far as we know, all cis women. Only a few, very small percentage are African American, and as far as we know, no trans people in space. And so, part of this project and part of my aromatase project that I'm developing here during the residency is to try and explode open what we think about space and how we can think about space travel and space existences as a way to also think about how we live on Earth, right? Because thinking about space is always related to thinking about how we live on this planet, or at least it is for me, just as science fiction is not about the future, it's about our present in a lot of ways. And so regarding this question of technology, I think going back to the previous discussion, it's really about, for me, this merging of potentially much, much older understandings of how we modify our body and different ways of doing that, and combining that with new types of understandings and repurposings of contemporary technology. And, it's why I sort of approach these things from an artistic perspective, because I have this training in my past as a scientist. And, I learned how to do this within sort of the scientific context, but then, because of the ways in which science functions these days, I was not able to ask the questions that I wanted to ask. And so I see sort of the art science connections and the collaborations and the discussions and the debates that we have about the terminology, which we're having tonight, as the way to explore these questions that I wouldn't be able to do otherwise. And so, yes, I think it's vitally important, but it also needs to be distributed more evenly because certainly people who have access, I'm a very privileged trans woman, I'll say that up front, right? I have access to hormones. In the US, I had health insurance, have health insurance and everything like that, right? So I have access to it and way too many people don't. And again, while we're talking about this with respect to transgender issues tonight, I also wanted to be very clear that this applies across a very much larger domain of access, of redistributing possibilities and relationships, and sort of trying to break down some of these gatekeepers that prevent access to these types of technologies, pharmaceuticals, and so forth. But trying to do it in a way that also, you could have conversations about the effects of these things on the body, because they do. And, messing with the endocrine system is not something that you want to do sort of willy-nilly, right? And so that's also part of this educations and conversations amongst ourselves, right? Going back to sort of the early days of feminism, Our Bodies, Ourselves, these manuals that sort of taught each other how to do things and how to use different types of technologies. And as Leah was saying, doing this today in a much more intersectional way.
Thank you, Adriana. Any comments as of now? Otherwise,
Yes, when I'm listening to all of you, I'm always thinking about, we are talking about differences, space, earth, male, female, about these polarities, and I think it's mainly being in the homeostasis, in some way in this dimension in between, being in ravnovesje, Domen, balance, being in balance. So when we think about differences, we need them. We need diversity. I would not be happy if female will be equal to male in all the aspects. We need this enrichment, possibility for growth. And we also have to think about also similarities, this fundamental, what is fundamentally human? What is the need to be seen, to be heard, to be in contact, and also autonomy. And I think we are all searching for this balance between contact, autonomy, between male, female. So we are all searching for this balance. I was thinking about that.
And if I may just say one more thing, sort of directly on that, for me, sort of Synology and some of these ideas that I'm coming up with or thinking about and the projects that I do is about shifting that balance a little bit, and sort of like what happens when we think about the possibilities of shifting that balance. So.
And just a question, is that really a balance? Because again, a balance is between two axes, and is it, for instance, instead of black and white, why don't we start thinking about like a world of colors, which have all their own vibrations, their own signal. They are all different. And it's the way how we group it and we synthesize all this diversity is just to reflect of our intellect, much more than, I think, some very characteristic. Because I was thinking when I was listening to you, but okay, male, female, but if there was so much study on rich and poor than it was on male and female, we could probably see some permanent things and attribute this to some naturalism, to some, there's some people who are born poor and some people who are born rich, and their brain are reacting different. But actually, you don't exactly in that context analyze what you want. You are grabbing a full reality, which have a lot of difference, and we try to make it fit in two packs. Maybe this is why this balance is maybe so hard to find, because there's maybe more access to this balance than just a two pole. just was building on this metaphor.
Anybody else? Any comments?
I was just going to say, yeah, exactly. I mean, but one of the things that I've thought about this is the physics concept of superposition, which is sort of the overlaying of, it comes from sort of the wave theory. How do waves intersect and interact? And sort of it's like the layering of these waves on top of each other can give a very, very complicated result in the end, right? And so it's a theory that's used very much within quantum mechanics, which is also about sort of indeterminacy in a certain sense, right? And so for me, it's more about not so much one or the other, a binary, but sort of how do these things intersect in a very complicated moving surface. It's very hard to explain my mental image of this, but that's sort of how I see it.
Thank you, Adriana. I want to move now to Leah. I have some questions for you. And I wanted to ask you about you being a part of the Transakcija initiative, which is a really important initiative here in Slovenia. And I wanted to talk to you about the challenges of creating platforms for the trans experience. I think that through the whole debate, some challenges were already highlighted, but I think it would be interesting to recap and reiterate, and also, yeah, explain it in the context of your work in Transakcija. So perhaps if you start by begin to say a couple of words about the Transakcija initiative, and then about the challenges that you face with building the platforms.
Sure. So Transakcija Institute is the only organism that is working systematically on trans thematic here in Slovenia. So we have two main orientation, like towards toward trans population and working for trans community, and doing a work of more systematic work for legal gender recognition and for the way how the medical transition is happening for trans people here in Slovenia. So this is very shortly like what are the mission and activities of Transakcija. Well, just to give a little piece of context, trans people are very famous in literature and medias, and so people have the feeling they are around and they live with that image. Their representation of trans people, and I mean some character, it has been identified a lot of things that today we can call transgender. Retroactively, and in different society through different time, but absolutely not in the Occidental society, absolutely not in the Christian society, absolutely not in that culture and society has been erasing completely all traces of gender. And reducing it to some category, transgender in that context, especially trans woman. It means way more than it is in reality. It's the symbol of someone who has the power because of penis, and who is somehow renouncing to it. And this figure is in literature, in the history of our culture, associated with very negative things, with thieves, with the stealing identity, with something who is abusing the confidence that homeless people put on them. And in that context, when psychiatry is getting more popular, it heritated the case of trans people in that context that they have been medicalized. So this history of medicalization and pathologization of trans people, it's still very, very present. We are still in this area, yet we are getting a little, maybe we're trying to get it out of that. But the problem here is when you try to talk about trans people to a general public, there's a lot of problem because of this big question of sex, that is like how we understand sex. Like if sex is something which is given at birth on a way that is yes or no, and can't and has no evolution during life, well, it's a category that is purely cultural, because this is not what happened in the body, it's not what happened in nature. These things are more movable, and so the thing when I try to explain to someone who are trans people, they think they know, because they got this representation through media and science, that trans people are, for instance, someone who is assigned male at birth, male sex at birth, wants, to transform the body in order to be someone, to be something or someone that they were not before. And this is, as a trans activist, the most difficult idea, the most difficult shift to make happen in the mind of people. And that's why the project of Adriana is, I think, very poetic, because it's conveying all these notions that sex is maybe not exactly what we think we know, or if this is it, then we have to make some space for a category of people that are existing in society from a very long time, and in each society. So it's obviously shows some reality, and we don't have space for these people in our culture. And I think the way how Adriana is making the let's go to space, as a trans woman, I completely get it. Because when as a trans activist, my job is to explain people that have not this experience of being born, and somebody gives you something and say this is your role, this is your script, and you do that, and that's it. And there's no way to actually say it's not the reality, it's not who I am, That's the most problematic part, because people want to understand trans people to reduce it to the binary system. For instance, me, like people would say some male that wanted to be a woman, and it's a way how to erase and to invalidate completely the reality, the complexity of the nature. Like, as I live my own experience, and this is very hard again to share with cis people who doesn't have this experience, but my penis is female because I am female. And this mind shift, it's really not easy, not at school, not in education context, not in scientific, medical context. I mean, there's a lot of, in each of us, there's a lot of mechanism of things that are made by society to not allow that kind of transgression, if I can use this word. I don't know if I answered the question. I get a little lost maybe, but yeah, that was my answer.
Thank you, Leah. No, you answered perfectly, and you also answered my next question simultaneously. I wanted to ask you about about the challenges when working in, because you also work with media and video and film, right? And also added the TransTube channel. So I wanted to ask you about the challenges that you face today when working in the new media landscape, but I think you already explained it perfectly. So I don't know if you want to add anything to this, or yeah. But for instance, another question would be then your work in with video and documentary film. It's probably also serves as a similar platforming role as your work in Transakcja and as this artistic research practice, for instance, of Adriana.
Sorry, I'm not completely sure if I understood your question.
Yeah, sorry, it's a bit late. I'm already a bit tired. So yeah, I wanted to ask you, does your work in film and video also relate to the to your activist work within the Transakcja initiative?
Yes. So I mean, before my transition, so I was actually involved. My profession was camera operator. So, and I'm using these skills now at Transakcja, because I believe that Slovenia is it's a small country, but it's hard to get people to talk about that kind of thematic, and then digital world is perfect. It's a good tool, because it doesn't mean people have to come to Ljubljana to gather to a club, or you can have access to people who are like usually not having access to services. So it's I think also the video, I can see that it's acting on a different way than the activist, the angry activist side part is functioning. You can lead a fight on a legal way, but the videos, it's like it's something we produce and we show. I think through videos you can talk about humanity, and you can talk about things that are maybe harder to talk about if there's not this medium. So yeah.
Thank you. This then also brings us back to the question that Adriana raised at the beginning of our discussion regarding the difference between, for instance, arts or science in the way how we can not only address or try to answer, but also in the way how we raise questions in the first place. Adriana, would you like to add something to that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, going back to some of the stuff that Pia was talking about with new materialism, I'm very influenced by the work of Karen Barad and her thinking about agential realism, interaction, and these concepts that are very complicated, but also are coming from a very rooted material or experiences of her as a physicist working within quantum mechanics. But for me, one of the things that's really that I take from her work that's very important to my practice is the idea of the phenomenon and the ways in which the phenomenon sort of is not arbitrary, but is something that necessarily arises out of the apparatus that you use to study it, right? And so in a certain sense, the apparatus that you create, whether it's in a scientific experiment or a conceptual thought or an artistic practice, doesn't necessarily determine your outcome, but very much shapes what types of things you're going to be able to ask, what types of things you're going to be able to experience or perceive. And so for me, artistic practice or different types of scientific work or different types of conceptual thought allow us to create different phenomena or understand different phenomena by changing the different apparatuses. And so in a sense, for me, xenology and artistic research is about creating a different apparatus to necessarily create a different phenomena. Now, it may be related to these other phenomena that we study from sort of something that we call science or something that we call art or something that we call philosophy, right? But what happens when we begin to shift these different areas and bring them together in different sort of complicated friction-y ways, you know, what sort of things do we get? What sort of phenomena do we get from this? And how can we use this to come to a different understanding of this world, which is so complex that it really must exceed any one way of knowing it, right? And so this goes back exactly to what you were talking about, Neža, earlier about the sort of the different ways of understanding these things, different perspectives, and your comment about that, Leah. So what are the, for me, the sort of more meta level question is, what are the apparatuses that we need to construct these days to create different types of phenomena that we want to understand in the sort of the terminology of Karen Barad?
Thank you, Adriana. Any comments from the other speakers?
Yeah, I would say that it's very close to the, I think, the politics of powers. It's very yeah, it's interestingly the same kind of way of thinking about, not about trying to define at one precise time one A object and B, but more like the relation that links them. You know?
Thank you. So if there are no more comments, I think I would like to read some from our audience. But yeah, if there's anything anybody would like to say, you can still say it. No? Okay, so then I will just read a bunch. So White Feather Hunter from YouTube has another question for Adriana. And they say that they really appreciate your inquiry into the source of the hormones and ask if, have you heard of Louise Mackenzie's proposal for a body bank that artists can contribute to and share with each other? Or Mary Magic's estro hacking workshops? How would you feel about an estrogen donor that you knew on a personal level? And they add, there could be complications with such a relationship in terms of tackling instrumentalization of bodies, but do you think that this would be a better alternative to animal sources? Okay.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Thanks, White Feather Hunter. So yeah, I've talked a little bit with Louise about her project, and yeah, I know Mary's work, and they're both, you know, amazing projects. I will say, and hopefully I'm not giving away too much of trans culture here, but there's this joke that there needs to be a fairy that for trans men who want to get rid of their breasts, they can donate their breasts to trans women who want them. And for all other types of body parts, genitals, you know, hormones and so forth. So I think that's a really fascinating idea. It would open up all sorts of very interesting questions about ownership, about power, as Leah was talking about. You know, what happens when the estrogen donor is maybe at a higher socioeconomic class? You know, what sort of demands would potentially be able to be made? You know, I could think of very interesting relationships of this with different types of BDSM subcultures. I mean, there would be really quite a lot of fascinating things to think about with such a proposal, and yeah, maybe something to consider. So yeah.
Thank you. And Ivan A. Gurm, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, so I apologize in advance. It's a comment that is relating to part of the discussion from earlier, and they say gender biological sex dichotomy is kind of outdated. Also, let's not forget about intersex variations. This should be explored by scientists instead of still presenting sex characteristics as a binary. And they thank Leah for her comment. And also they mention, yes, they mention an animated film directed by Leah. So perhaps Leah, you could tell us more about the film. There's also a link, but I can't open it at this moment.
Yeah, that's, I can give you the link then. It's just a short film we released this year as an adaptation of the manual, the main resource we have for informing about transness to a very broad public. So this is, I was talking actually about the movie without talking about it, because I was explaining how I think the aesthetic experience can help. So art can help actually change some perceptions that we have. So the movie is accessible on YouTube. It's called Between Blue and Rose and Pink, sorry, and it's on the TransTube channel, the YouTube channel of Transgression. So I invite you to have a look.
Thank you. I wish we could share this link. I personally don't know how, but yes, it's on the transactia.cse web page. So I invite everybody to check that out. So, I mean, the debate has been going on for some while. I think the fatigue is slowly getting to us. So I would like to ask for the final remarks or questions. Are there any? We discussed a lot, and there's so much still to discuss. I think it's far too much for one debate.
I mean, I'll just say, you know, I'm really happy that we had such a diverse and various amount of approaches to this, right? I mean, I think going back to some of the things that Pia was bringing up, you know, in order to address these issues of feminism, of identity, of technology, it really has to involve more of these types of conversations and frictions and so forth in order to figure out how can we approach all these. How can we use all of this diversity of approaches in order to develop these new capabilities and capacities, you know, that I see as, you know, and that others may see as just being able to live their daily lives, right? Because it's clear that as we've sort of made these distinctions over the centuries, at least within Western thought over recent centuries, it really has not gotten us to a good place. And so figuring out how do we bring these things together in some way that's going to create a lot of tension, but in a way that will hopefully be a productive one in order to create these new possibilities. I think that's absolutely vital, and I'm glad we were able to do a bit of this tonight.
Yes, you said it very nicely, Adriana. I think the goal is to start to questioning yourself, the question you didn't put on before. So I did. You made me do it. So yes, that's I think is the goal of also of our discussion.
Okay, if there are no other comments, I think I would like to finish it with one last question from our viewers, and it's from Luka Princic on YouTube. The question is for Leah. They say, just to maybe clarify, when you talk about sex, in what in what does that differ from gender, or are these two interchangeable for you? I think that we, in a way, already addressed this, but Leah, if you want to answer the question.
Yeah, I mean, so we distinguish here in English gender identity as something that is that can be linked to some, I think, biological aspect of the body and the way how you live it, especially. But it's definitely a matter of like who you are. Like the sex is a word that has a very so many different kind of meaning depending of what is the context in which you use it. So in our context today, we think about sex as I think the sum, the altogether the total of the biological aspects as chromosome, hormones, genes, and the way how it influence, shape the body, and the way how we necessarily also the way how we interpret it. And so the main distinction, I would say, is that sex has been used for describing something as a very objective and very identifying and known thing, which is actually today we're discovering that it's maybe sex is way more complicated than what we thought. And I will stop here because I'm really not a biologist, but that's just like to start with.
I just want to add that I think it's very much depends on the context you use the word. So yes, as you said, Leah, sex can be a lot of things. So
on that note, if there are not any more comments, I would like to thank all of our guest speakers. Adriana Knouf, Neža Grgurevič, Brezavšček, Leah Aymard. And of course, I would like to thank Kapelica Institute for organizing this, and a big thank you to all of the viewers that joined us in this discussion.
And thank you, Domen, for asking all these wonderful questions and for shepherding us through a complex topic.